Hello AP Econ students, this is Miss Haley and welcome back to our lesson 5. So we just ended with aggregate demand and shifters and now we're going to talk about aggregate supply and shifters. So what is aggregate supply? So we're still using the same definition for aggregate, so all of those small little parts added into a whole, but now we're talking about supply. So the amount of goods and services that firms will produce in an economy at different price levels. So we're saying all those different price levels, all those different goods and services, what amount will all different firms want to produce. So not only are we talking about the supply for everything by all firms, we're going to differentiate between short run and long run, which that differentiation has to do with whether prices have been able to adjust, have become flexible, which is what we're going to see in the long run, or if input prices are sticky and have not all adjusted, and that's what we're going to look at in the short run. So in the short run, what we see is that wages and resource prices are not increasing with price levels, that they're sticky. So for example, if a firm, because firms always want to see how much profit we can make, and we're always going to be comparing the total revenue and the total cost. So if a firm currently makes 100 units that are sold for $1, so we're going to multiply that quantity times that price to find that total revenue, and that the only cost is $80 of labor. How much is profit? We know that it's the total revenue minus the total cost, and so we're going to have $20 in profit, which is pretty good for this company. They are making profit. They're not breaking even. They are actually making some money. But then if in the short run, if price level doubles, so where there is inflation, how will that impact the firm? So we're seeing that 100 units sell now for $2. So to calculate the total revenue, we would take 100, the quantity, times 2, the price. And we're seeing we already have a lot more total revenue. And in this situation, again, we're saying in the short run, that means that input prices have not yet adjusted. They're sticky, that they've stayed the same even though there is an increase in price level, there's inflation. So if we have a doubling of our total revenue and that we have a consistent total cost, of course, this company is going to see an increase in their total profits. We haven't adjusted for inflation yet, but they're saying, oh my goodness, in the short run, we have so much more profit. We want to actually increase production because in this situation, why would I stay at this 100 units? Why wouldn't I sell even more? Because we're seeing that there's going to be a large increase in potential profits. So that's why with this short run aggregate supply curve, we're seeing a direct relationship. So the opposite of that downward sloping indirect aggregate demand curve, now we're seeing that when price levels are increasing, at least in the short run, when we are having sticky input prices, that there is an increase in our real domestic output. So as the price level increases, we want to be making more and more of those items because we're seeing that there's a potential for profit. So it's different now than when we talk about long run aggregate supply, because the long run is determined about when input prices can actually change, that they're no longer sticky. So what does this actually look like? So if we're looking at the same example, the firm has a total revenue of $100, and we're saying that's coming from each item, those 100 quantities cost $1. So we are making $100 in total revenue. We still have to take away that total cost of $80 and we're left with $20 profit. And so in the long run, if price level doubles, instead of having that total revenue of 200 and keeping the constant total cost, now in the long run, workers, they've been able to petition, join a union, barter, and discuss with their employers. They've been able to demand higher wages to match this price level. They're saying, we're workers who are still needing to buy items in this economy when there's inflation. We want to have our wages be at that same level so we aren't struggling to buy our basic necessities. And so if there's labor cost that's doubling to 160, we take that total revenue and that total cost, and now the total profit is only $40. Real profit, though, if we factor out the fact that price level is doubling, this $40 will only have the real purchasing power as that beginning 20. So if real profit is not changing, we're seeing in this situation the wages are exactly equal to that increased total cost. The firm has no incentive to increase output. So how does this look graphically? Well, the long run aggregate supply curve is actually a straight vertical line. So this is showing the relationship that no matter how price level increases, there will be no change in quantity. So we would call this an inelastic supply curve. That price levels, even if they increase, the GDP doesn't, because all prices are flexible. And this is a very important curve that we're going to talk about a lot more next week, but this long-run aggregate supply curve represents full employment and the amount of GDP that is able to be achieved when a country is at full employment. So just remember that, write that down for now, and we'll apply it more next week. So we can't just know and understand that the long-run aggregate supply is this straight vertical line and that the aggregate supply in the short run is a upward sloping direct relationship between price level and GDP. We need to think about how can these two curves actually be shifted. And so for long run, it's always going to be something that changes the nation's ability to produce output. So we can break it down to this acronym of RIT. So that's where Miss Charlotte went to college, grade school. So resources when they've changed, institutions when they change, and technology when they change. They're going to shift this long-run aggregate supply. And then short-run aggregate supply, those will shift with any of these RIT factors, because anything changed in the long run will change the short run, or if there's a change in input prices. So let's look at some examples of these. So again, shifts of long-run aggregate supply. If the whole nation is able to has increased their capacity of production, there'll be a shift to the right. And if the whole nation has increased their decreased their national capacity of production, there'll be a shift to the left. So how would we see that? So if there's new resources that are available, so there's new oil deposits in Saudi, then there'd be a permanent change in availability. We're going to see a shift to the right of longer aggregate supply. If there's a change in institutions, like an effectiveness of an institution, so if the political instability, like let's say Venezuela right now, where some people are recognized as a leader but some aren't, that's leading to overthrow possibly of a nation, and so overwhelmingly that nation is not able to produce the same kind of products or the same amount of products, then there would be a shift to the left of long-run aggregate supply. And then the last, for technology, if there's a change in productivity, and so maybe all the computers in that nation have been destroyed by a virus, we would see a shift to the left of the long-run aggregate supply. So the only three things that would ever shift the long-run aggregate supply are change of resources, institutions, and technology, RIT. And then shifts of short-run aggregate supply have to do more with a change, an increase or decrease in firms' cost of production. So even though, right, we're saying that input prices are sticky, if there's an increase or decrease in that short run of one specific cost of production, we would see the short-run curve shift right or left. So let's look at those examples. So if there's a change in import resource price, which we could see from either inflationary expectations or price of domestic and imported resources, we see a shift to the left or right of that curve. So if you are a company that relies on lumber or steel, if those items that you're importing are either increasing or decreasing in price, then you are going to have a shift to the right or the left. So let's say that you need lumber to build houses and you see an increase in price of that Canadian lumber. So you're still going to take that Canadian lumber, you need to buy it, but you're going to be overwhelmingly making less production as a whole because that Canadian lumber costs a lot more. So we're going to see a shift left of that aggregate supply curve. Versus if we're seeing a decrease in the price of Chinese steel. And so though all the companies that want to import Chinese steel, they're actually better off and they're going to produce more of their items. Then we see a shift to the right of aggregate supply because a decrease in that input price. So if we talk about inflationary expectations, these inanimate resources don't really care about that. They aren't having to make a livelihood or put food on the table for the family. But if workers expect that there's going to be inflation in the future, they are going to bargain and try to fight with their unions to demand higher wages. And so this would decrease aggregate supply because those firms who are hiring the workers now at a higher wage are going to only be able to produce less of their products at all different price levels. So these are the two ways related to input resource prices that would shift aggregate supply. And then the last discussion about short-run aggregate supply is this idea of a supply shock. And so Whereas we're saying inflationary expectations, we're thinking about the future, or if prices of domestic and imported resources change, we're talking about the present. Supply shocks are something that happen in the present, but that might be a surprise. And so there's something that still are impacting input prices because that is something that would shift the short run aggregate supply. So if there's a negative supply shock, and that is an example like if there's freezing temperatures in Florida, this is not something that people expect, that Florida got very cold, and so this specific item that some people might use as their input resource becomes much more scarce, and so the price of the oranges increases. So if there's that higher input price, we would see a shift to the left of the aggregate supply short run curve. On the converse of that, if we see that there's a positive supply shock, so it's still a surprise event impacting input prices, but if it's something where it's like, wow, we have a dramatic drop in oil barrel prices, that's actually really helpful for companies who need to buy oil, and it would decrease the cost of gas, then we would see a lower input price that would cause a positive supply shock. So positive supply shocks always shift the curve to the right, where negative supply shocks always shift this aggregate supply curve to the left. So now you all should feel comfortable thinking about what does aggregate supply mean, not just in the short run, but also in the long run. When and why might we see a shift in aggregate supply that in the short run? Why might we see a shift in long run aggregate supply? And begin thinking about what we can see from aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and long run aggregate supply all meeting together at this equilibrium of price level and quantity. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.